Welcome to the Periphery. I'm Alan Elrod. My guest today is Jessica Pishko. Jessica is a lawyer and a journalist who focuses primarily on sheriff accountability. She obtained her JD from Harvard Law and an MFA from Columbia. And I'm really excited to talk to her today. We're going to be talking about sheriffs because it's an office that is really important in American politics and in our justice system, but probably one that I would say gets overlooked, although I think it gets a lot more coverage now, but certainly is not as well understood as some others. There are over 3,000 sheriffs in the United States. It is typically in a county the highest elected law enforcement officer. And so I'm thrilled to talk with Jessica about the kind of nature of sheriff's offices, the politics that goes into that, some of the kinds of examples we have of where that may be fraying in the context of our politics more broadly. So Jessica, I want to just let you start by talking about kind of the historical background of the sheriff, what a sheriff is, and then maybe get a little bit into the fact that sheriff's offices are shaped by being an elected law enforcement office, which differentiates them a little bit from some other kinds of positions.
Sure. Thank you for that very kind intro. So I think one of the things to think about before we get into the history of sheriffs is that, one of the tricky parts of the history of sheriffs when you start to actually dig in is that there's sort of the history of sheriffs has largely been created and written by sheriffs. So one of the first things I discovered when I began to look at the history and see what I could confirm is that there isn't a lot of neutral sheriff history. So in other words, sheriffs write histories for their website, but much of this is not fact checked, right? There was no way to fact check it. So a good example is that many sheriffs cite a quote from Thomas Jefferson that calls the sheriff, quote, one of the most important elected offices in the country. And that quote, which is often used and repeated by sheriffs, is a misquote of a letter Thomas Jefferson wrote in which he was talking about the ability of the state to obtain taxes. So he was actually writing to someone else about the taxation of his lands in Virginia. And he was a bit complaining that tax assessors, which included sheriffs at that time, were taking his money and evaluating his property. And as one might expect of Thomas Jefferson, this was something he was upset about because he thought there should be local control of taxes and valuation. So in the context, this makes sense, but it also, you have to realize that he was in no way arguing that sheriffs were very important law enforcement officers. So that's sort of the way to background it. Most people agree at this point that, sheriffs are a sort of portmanteau of the word shire reeve, which was shire was what they called a county in England, and reeve was what they called a politician. So from what everyone can tell, the sheriff was an office in England, and like many things in England, it was imported into the American colonies. So and one of the things that's interesting about sheriffs is that sheriffs were imported into the early colonies, and right now sheriffs represent counties. So some people, if you're an urban person, you may not think about your county, but every state is divided into counties. There are 3,081 sheriffs. So every state has sheriffs except for Alaska, Hawaii, and Connecticut. Alaska and Hawaii also don't have counties. So this sort of explains why they don't have sheriffs. But they represent the county level, and every state has counties. Every person must live in a county. And if this is sort of getting a little wonky local politics, but cities have to be created by other authorities, but counties are a priori exist in states. So one of the issues is that when America was created and states were created, counties were created along with it. Um, and even though sheriffs are now elected at the county level, in the what best we could tell in early colonial days is that in some places there were sheriffs before there were counties, and in some places those counties, when they did exist, didn't have any type of county charter or county law. So the best one can tell is there were sheriffs, there were some counties, there were states. And so as a result, sheriffs became created early on as state law officers because there weren't really any county or county charters. So they sort of pre-existed county government. A lot of their early functions were largely tax collection and things like ensuring that people voted. So this is sort of, again, like early on, pre-1800s, much of their job was collecting property. They often took ballots door to door, so people would sort of vote, like they would go to each house and ensure that people voted. They also did a lot of fee for service type work, which continued on into the 1800s. So the sheriffs were also something to the effect of like a bounty hunter. They would get paid to hold people, arrest people, hunt down fugitives, especially in kind of the early Americas. And once America had claimed a vast majority of, the Western United States, sheriffs were often served as these sort of quasi bounty hunters because there really weren't enough federal officials to do the kind of policing they felt like was necessary. And so this is where sheriffs kind of developed their trade, and also partially why sheriffs in the West and in the Northeast and South all have slightly different characters just because of the way and time they were created, right? So the Western states are all created after about 1850. I think California became a state around 1852. So you have to figure that all those Western states barely existed as states, and so they didn't have any law enforcement. They were run largely with vigilante committees, which was how the West sort of enforced law. They had what we would call like a vigilante system. And so when sheriffs became a part of the state landscape, most of the time they were simply placed the head of these vigilante committees, which were largely tasked with, again, hunting down fugitives or dealing with, people that they thought were problems, which again sort of gets into their nature of the nature of policing and other problematic things. The time when sheriffs, I think, really rose to prominence and when most people think of sheriffs is around the Civil War and after. So I often think of sheriffs as pre-Civil War, post-Civil War. After the Civil War, sheriffs kind of took on a greater role, especially in the South. And I'm sure many people have heard of slave patrols in the South. And, I think most people are now familiar with the history of policing and their linkage to slave patrols, which was to say, when slavery was an institution in the United States, there was really no need for police. Uh, Black enslaved people were simply punished by by the people enslaving them. Uh, there was not really a need for jails or prisons. There's not really a need to arrest people. That changed after the Civil War. And this is where one of the things that sheriffs began to do was to enforce racial segregation. They took on more jobs as largely holding people in jail. This became like the sheriff's primary job. And so, one of the things they did was they spent their time arresting and putting primarily Black people into jail. And this became the rise of what a lot of people call the convict leasing movement. So one of the things the sheriffs did in the South was they would go, in many places, what happened was sheriffs or their deputies, who were often just any white people around, would go out, they would arrest Black citizens. These laws were often called the Black Codes. They forbid things like loitering or traveling after dark or, not having a job or various other things. And they would arrest those people, bring them to jail. and then usually without a trial, promptly leased them out to private companies who would use these people for labor. Um, I think that, this is something that really can't be overstated, the damages of the convict leasing system. So, at its height, something like 1 in 4 people sent to the convict leasing system died. Um, they were sent to private industry, including things like logging, tar collection in the Everglades, citrus production, coal mining. So all sorts of things on top of farming. And, the incentive for sheriffs was that they received the quote unquote salary of these workers. So there was a direct financial benefit for the sheriffs. A vast amount of their income came from sending Black men into a convict leasing system. And often people went into the system, no one knew where they were. They were sort of kidnapped off the street, their families weren't told. And again, the rate of death was very high. So I think it's important to remember that sheriffs were very much implicated in a system that, was incredibly harmful and akin to something like enslavement.
I
Should I
want
go
to.
on, or do you have a question at that
No, I
point?
do. I want to throw something at you before we get
Yeah.
into more like real world examples, because I think I want to try to root this in maybe sort of the popular imagination people might have. And I'm curious what you think about this formulation. But when I think of sheriffs, I think that most Americans, in terms of like the popular imagination of sheriffs, it probably comes from two sort of fictional ideas. And I think one is probably Andy Griffith and the other is sort of John Wayne, right? And
Right.
the Andy Griffith formulation is sort of the gentlemanly sheriff who is really like part law enforcement officer, part counsel, part sort of just a man about town who assists people in various ways, dispenses wisdom, sort of takes care of the town drunk. And then the John Wayne one is very much that sort of vigilantism, rough justice, right? And I think those are probably, to my mind, the two ways, whether it's intentional or not, that a lot of Americans probably conceive of the sheriff. And then it's really probably the two most famous kind of icons in a pop cultural sense of like what it is to be a sheriff. So I'm curious, like maybe you could, if you think that that's fair, and two, if it is fair, how you could sort of take that and then set it against the realities, right, of sheriff's offices.
Yeah. I mean, obviously Andy Griffith comes up quite a lot. Um, I think one of the things, I mean, clearly both of them are idealized, right? One is extremely masculine and sort of hyper, I was going to say hyper masculine, hyper violent. The Andy Griffith model is sort of a family based model. I would say both of them have like their roots in some truths, but it also cannot be denied that I think in both formulations of the sheriff, you have to remember that they are enforcing like very specific kind of racial separation and white supremacy. So, one of the things about sheriffs that was very true, especially in the Midwest, and the sort of quote Andy Griffith style sheriff, is that oftentimes being the sheriff was a sort of family endeavor. So sheriffs honestly didn't, oftentimes sheriffs did not receive a lot of pay. They were not paid by the county. This was a relatively recent invention. Most county officers weren't paid by the county. And so one of the things that happened was that becoming a sheriff was a family job, which meant that the jail was usually attached to the sheriff's house, so like a sort of adjunct. The sheriff's wife was often the one who did the laundry for people held there. She did all the cooking. Sometimes she served as like a sort of adjunct guard.
And
And oftentimes
that's such
yeah.
a fascinating image to describe to me, because that like description sounds so much almost like a church pastor, where like the congregation sometimes even like, and maybe this is because I grew up, my grandfather was a Church of Christ preacher, but like you might have a house adjacent to the church, and then a number of the actual services, like maintenance things, are just performed by the preacher and his wife and that kind of thing.
Yeah, it wasn't unlike that. I mean, it was sort of right, like unpaid labor on behalf of like the sheriff's wife and their children. Another often, if there were women that needed to be incarcerated, they would just live in the house with the sheriff's family. Children, sometimes foster children, so something, orphans or children for who, for whatever reason, had nowhere to go, would often also live with the sheriff and their family, and were considered sort of like wards of the sheriff's wife, which is also like not unlike being a pastor, right? So sort of bringing in folks who have nowhere to go. Um, yeah, there's great descriptions of the wives cooking large Thanksgiving dinners. Sometimes they would all eat together. And, I think one of the things that shows, this I was just thinking of the Eddie Griffith idea, was that there was, there still is and was a lot of porousness between being inside of a jail and outside of the jail. So, I mean, early jails were not particularly secure. Escapes were common. Uh, Sometimes walls were just made of straw, so people could dig out or make holes, right? So it was a very, like, we think now of jails as sort of iron with bars and like it's really secure and nobody goes in there and it's very unsafe. But really, early jails were just it was just a room in the house, and it was sort of no concept of like you wouldn't go in and out of the jail, or that the people inside the jail wouldn't come out. And there are always these like stories of like sheriff's wives who serve as like watch people, or they use their gun to like defend themselves against escapees. So escapees were like a huge issue that many people had to deal with, again because it wasn't very secure. um in the West, you know one of the things that was very different in the West was the population was very different, and the population of white people was a lot more scattered, right? So to be clear, the West was very much populated with, non-Anglos, so people who were Mexican, which a great deal of the West was part of Mexico, and Native Americans. So but the Anglo population was rather scattered. And so because of that, the West had a much more militaristic structure, because the Anglo settlers and early governments spent a lot of their time in their previous lives had largely been military people. And once they became states and sort of tried to establish, again, Anglo governments, that they spent a lot of time kind of remaining in that same kind of militaristic mindset, in which case they had, again, as you might point out, posses of vigilantes. It was a great deal more violent. We picture more like chasing, chasing thieves or something. And a big issue at the time was also trains and train thefts. So sheriffs and US marshals spent more of their time like chasing alleged like train thieves or people who were like traveling on trains, because that was the primary transportation across. So they had a sort of slightly different set of priorities and concerns, and I think had developed and came from this more militaristic culture. Now, a great deal of that is sort of obviously romanticized. In many cases, there was not much I mean, to be fair, there were in many cases not much difference between the vigilantes and the people they were chasing. Particularly in California, which I know a bit more about, there were often just cases of warring groups of ranchers, or ranchers who had been Mexican, who had claimed land, and now Anglos were claiming that land. So they, were getting into fights. And I mean, similarly to the South, you know, the vigilante system kind of served as like judge, jury, executioner. So they, right, sort of came out, they would just enact justice. I'm sure, one of the events I think many people think of is the Chinese massacre in Los Angeles, which was an incident in the 1850s in which a great deal of a vigilante group of Anglo people, led by the sheriff, kind of went out into the street and began to massacre Chinese people. You know, what's interesting in that case is, and this was also true many times in the South in which sheriffs facilitated lynchings, it was not always so much that the sheriff led the vigilante justice or led the lynching, but rather the sheriff felt himself at the mercy of the posse. So it would often be something to the effect of the group of vigilantes might meet and say, well, we think we need to uh, kill this person. And the sheriff might say, well, okay, I guess. And when you think of the reality that the sheriff is faced with something like probably 10 to 20 armed men, you could imagine that the sheriff's reaction is sort of like, well, okay, what will I do? Will I say no? And, this was true in the South with many lynchings that, you know, white, basically white armed mobs, vigilantes would come to the jailhouse door and demand access to someone being held in the jail. And the sheriffs might say, well, we're not supposed to do that, but okay, because there's, 20 to 50 white men there. And they might, the truth was that in many events, they were largely more concerned about being hurt in the process of the lynching. And so they would sort of get out of the way.
So I want to. This brings me to something I intended to talk about, but I think that's such an interesting place to jump off because you're describing a kind of almost powerlessness, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which really cuts against some of the more contemporary movements within sheriffs' offices, right? Which is this constitutional sheriffs movement, which is all about the idea of the sheriff as a kind of ultimate authority, right? And I want to let you dig into that because it's and maybe even explain in more detail, right? The notion of constitutional sheriff's movement, because that just seemed like a natural jumping off point, because the stories you're describing here are not sheriffs leading the charge, not sheriffs even necessarily cultivating the contexts for these lynchings and massacres, but really sheriffs kind of being cajoled and bullied. Now, granted, they're still law enforcement officers, they're still allowing and facilitating, but nevertheless, right, really sheriffs just sort of being bowled over by mobs. And this more contemporary movement around constitutional sheriffs, which is much more kind of assertive that like ultimately sheriffs are this kind of final authority in the United States. So I'd love to let you first, I guess, expound on what the constitutional sheriff movement is, then also, I guess, dig into that tension.
Yeah, I guess it would make sense if you're worried about, mass mobs that you would over exaggerate your powers. And again, this gets into like the myth versus the reality, right? So, and that it is actually a natural segue. So, the constitutional sheriff movement, as we call it today, is really born out of a movement from the 1950s that was called the Posse Comitatus movement. And the Posse Comitatus movement was started by a man named William Potter Gale. He was an avowed white supremacist. He also has he has his own very quirky history. Like he tried to run for president. He started various splinter groups that were all, and again, blatantly white supremacist in nature, and very much Christian nationalist white supremacist style. And, one of the things that inspired his, great ire towards equal rights was the desegregation of schools. And so he looked at the desegregation of schools and thought, well, this doesn't seem fair that the federal government can send in law enforcement and force schools to desegregate, which is again what happened in the US, right? They court said you have to desegregate, federal government said you have to desegregate, nobody desegregated. So they sent in troops, law enforcement officials with guns to force people to desegregate. In William Potter Gale's mind, this was a great intrusion on local power. And so what he said was, well, what really ought to be happening is the sheriffs ought to be telling all these federal troops to go away. And he termed this, sort of word called interposition, which gets used a lot in the constitutional sheriff movement, and said, well, the sheriffs should interpose between the people and the federal government, because the federal government is forcing the people to do something that they don't want to do, and the sheriffs represent the local people. And this sort of bloomed and took off, and various other people copied it, and eventually it became immensely popular among various groups of people. So it sort of became really popular with sovereign citizens. It became really popular with kind of producer movements, rural movements in like the Pacific Northwest. So it sort of bloomed into this idea that, the federal government ought not to have so much power, and that the person who should be kind of regulating federal intervention in local affairs is the sheriff. Now, this also relates back to what I was talking about before about maybe sometimes the lack of sheriff power, because one of the important parts of the sovereign citizen movement was that if the sheriff, you should go to your sheriff and tell him what you want him to do. And I'm using him pretty specifically for sheriffs because they are still 95% men. So it's a very, very masculine job. So the idea was sovereign citizens should go to their sheriff, tell him, I want you to do X. And if the sheriff doesn't do it, sovereign citizens argue that one was entitled to arrest the sheriff. They sort of have this process of like citizens arrest and citizens court martial. And if people are more familiar with the sovereign citizen movement, this is a sort of part of their ideas, is that the local people can decide for themselves what laws they want, who goes on trial, etc. So eventually this ideology, posse comitatus, kind of branched off into what we might call like militia movements. So, in the 80s, a lot of militias became immensely popular. And these were sort of the birthplaces of groups I think people are now familiar with, like the Oath Keepers. So the modern day constitutional sheriff movement was really born of this 1980s, 90s militia movement, which became really popular in the wake of things like Ruby Ridge standoff, the Waco standoff, and the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995. It was a really big turning point for all these militia movements. And so a sheriff in Arizona named Richard Mack, he was a rural sheriff in Graham County, Arizona, was sort of recruited by the Oath Keepers to start what would be something like a militia aligned movement for law enforcement officers. Richard Mack is kind of an interesting person. He is very devoutly Mormon. He was he was sheriff of Graham, Arizona, which is very, very rural. And he served only 2 terms, largely because in the middle of his second term, he was so involved with creating the constitutional sheriff movement that the people of the county just voted him out of office because they didn't think he was doing any work. So he neglects to mention that people didn't want him in office anymore. They thought he was sort of doing the slapdash job. One of the things that Richard Mack did is sort of birthing the constitutional sheriff movement that he'll talk quite a lot about, was he brought a lawsuit against the Brady Bill, which came about in 1996 when Bill Clinton passed what most people consider like the first large federal gun legislation. Richard Mack and a handful of other sheriffs sued, basically brought lawsuits funded by the NRA to argue that parts of the Brady Bill were unconstitutional. This resulted in a decision written by Antonin Scalia. It's called the Prince case, which is named after Sheriff Prince. And it essentially sets forth what we now see as like the modern evolution of the individual right to bear arms. So you could sort of see the intersection here of the NRA, gun interests, law enforcement, militia movements, right? So they sort of had this interest in establishing an individual right for gun ownership, which has basically paved the way to where the Supreme Court is now on guns. And so Richard Mack formed what he called the Constitutional Sheriff and Peace Officer Association. The original first name was something like the Confederacy of States, which he says he discarded because Confederacy, quote, had a bad connotation, which go figure. So, so you can imagine the fact that he contemplated this, you can imagine, right, where he's sort of going. Now, Richard Mack is an interesting person because I think he would not say that he had, I think, specific racial animus. One also has to bear in mind that he was a sheriff in Graham County, Arizona, and spent most of his prior law enforcement life in Provo, Utah. So, I mean, truly, he is from largely white places. So, I mean, I would argue to the extent he doesn't think about it much or say that he's not racist is because his interactions with, you know, his interactions with diversity have been rather limited. Since that time, he used the CSPOA as a launchpad to recruit sheriffs and other, I would say, sort of law enforcement wannabes into a group that would be militia aligned. So most of the goals of the CSPOA are aligned with the militia movement and then have sort of taken on the character of other far right groups. So, for example, the CSPOA was an early proponent of demanding President Obama's birth certificate. They adopted anti-immigration stances around Obama's presidency, which unfortunately, the presidency of Barack Obama created another sort of burst of activity in militia and constitutional sheriff movements. He revived the idea of interposition, which was the idea that sheriffs could tell federal law enforcement not to do things. In most cases, it was something related to gun reform, right? So sheriffs could tell federal agencies not to seize guns. And this you could sort of see related to, if people are familiar with the Ruby Ridge standoff, which, essentially related to firearms charges. Other things that Mac did, he became friendly with the Bundys. So he was involved in, the standoff at Malheur, involved with sort of Bundy related type anti-federal government stuff. And so, at a certain point in time, the CSPO actually quieted down quite a bit, particularly after the Bundy standoff. And then what seemed to have happened is that the election of Trump and COVID gave the constitutional sheriff movement a sort of new burst of energy. So the idea of not following COVID protocols became the new not following gun regulations. And that enabled the constitutional sheriff movement to get new people. So it sort of brought in an influx of folks who were now angry at both state and federal governments. It brought in an influx of people who were sympathetic to Trump and his sort of racist anti-immigrant ideas. And Trump himself also is like quite fond of sheriffs and brought them to the White House quite a lot. So I think it invigorated this idea of the sheriff and local law enforcement and a sort of what I would call like a very populist idea of law enforcement and leadership that I think revived this movement, which is why now we see this sort of, I think, resurgence of constitutional sheriffs in the news. We see sort of splinter groups and more recruiting, which is a bit hard to measure because they tell me how many people are in the group. So I think that it's brought about this like revival of the movement.
So what you're describing with the constitutional sheriff movement is certainly in particular sheriffs coming into friction, right, with federal law in ways that I think would frustrate or maybe even alarm people of a more center left or progressive persuasion. But we also, right, have seen sheriffs being defiant in ways that I think might get some applause, right, from people more of a more left persuasion, right? The most recent thing I think would be the sheriff in Bexar County in Texas, where San Antonio is, Salazar, right? Saying essentially, I'm not gonna enforce really Texas's new hyper stringent abortion laws. So I'd like to dig into that a little bit because that's a good example. And then also when we were chatting before we recorded, you mentioned when you get a little bit into sanctuary cities, right? Areas where sheriffs have taken positions of defiance that I think might line up more with people who have a progressive persuasion, but still present some of the same fundamental problems in some ways of just how much leeway does a sheriff have to be this openly defiant or contradictory toward federal laws and to skirt even enforcement in Texas it's a state law, but still, how much do we want sheriffs uh, uh, thumbing their nose at statutes, and obviously, the natural political response is to like it when it lines up with your politics and to not like it when it doesn't, but to get into the kind of actual real entanglements that come from this, because it seems like it's in general kind of a tradition for sheriffs to have this streak of of defiance in them, and that may or may not actually present a lot of problems at the local level.
I think that's a really good point. I do think that sheriffs, as locally elected figures, do often take on a role of some degree of defiance. I also joke that sheriffs particularly like being on TV in the media. So I haven't, I haven't met too many sheriffs who don't appreciate a lot of attention to themselves. I think that, one of the things I do think we saw when Trump was elected in 2016 was a great burst of, again, local defiance, but in favor of, as you would say, left-leaning or progressive-minded goals, right? And we saw this in, before I studied sheriffs, I did a lot of work on prosecutors. So, we also saw the progressive prosecutor movement, reform-minded prosecutor movement do much the same thing. Prosecutors, like sheriffs, are also elected on the county level. They also have a great deal of discretion. And so I think prior to 2016, there was a movement on the left to really elect prosecutors who would do things like not use the death penalty, not prosecute a lot of misdemeanors, not prosecute people for drug possession. These were people like Larry Krasner, who was elected in 2016. And, we can debate about, one could debate about how is the movement successful or not, but there's certainly like a concerted pushing in criminal reform circles to, put money into elections in which there's someone running who is sort of using their discretion for what we might call like liberal aligned values. I think that honestly, I think that sheriffs saw that and it became an idea that many of them wanted to emulate. So, after the election of Trump in 2016, the option for many localities that were liberal or largely democratic was to defy the federal government. And this really came about first in the kind of strict enforcement of immigration law. And so we saw, both cities, city police, counties and sheriffs say that they would do their best not to deport people. So in the terms of sheriffs, we saw that they would resist honoring what is called a detainer, which is basically a request to hold someone for ICE so that they can pick them up for deportation proceedings. And this became, right, a really, I think, popular issue for many people, particularly people in urban areas. There were also sheriffs elected between the years of 2016 and 2020 who ran specifically on a platform of not deporting people. So this was like a specific platform for many sheriffs. And we can debate where we are in terms of, quote, like reform sheriffs, like reform prosecutors, but there were sheriffs that I think saw themselves as reform sheriffs who ran on platforms of non-deportation. The other thing I think we saw in 2020 alongside this continuation was also the election of sheriffs in many counties that were the first Black sheriffs elected since Reconstruction. So a handful of counties in the South in 2020 elected their first Black sheriff since Reconstruction. So there's also this question of, is this also like representing some form of like a criminal system reform, pushing for more diversity, more liberal, liberal aligned values? Can sheriffs be aligned with those values? And so now that we've had, again, on the federal level, laws, I think both in terms of guns and abortion and other things forthcoming, we again see sheriffs, a handful of sheriffs who all were elected, I think, specifically intended to be reform minded, saying that, for example, in Texas, they would not enforce Texas's pretty vague. Texas is vague and also like really stringent criminalization of abortion. The sheriff in New Orleans, who was just recently elected, Susan Hudson, said the same, that she would not enforce, abortion criminalizations in Louisiana. I think the sheriff of Charleston, who was also elected on a reform-minded platform, said something similar. So there have been like a handful of sheriffs, and Javier Salazar was one of the sheriffs who said that this was something he was not going to enforce. He's also come out against Texas laws or movements and orders by Greg Abbott that have called for the sort of rapid deportation of migrants at the border. So Greg Abbott has implemented a number of state executive orders, usually called Operation Lone Star, which are essentially extrajudicial rapid deportations that he's conducting at the border. And so Sheriff Salazar has also said that he does not agree with this as well. He's not as involved because he's not on the border, but Abbott's movement has been extremely well backed by a large group of Texas sheriffs who are on the border. It's been a great, in Texas at least, this has been a huge movement for many conservative sheriffs to argue that, again, immigration is a big problem in Texas, and they've sort of rallied around this cause. So, I mean, I think that, as we see splintering, and I think really deep ideological divides between states, the federal government, and localities, we are seeing, honestly, sheriffs responding to that. And some of this to me is also actually just like deep divides between urban and rural. I think that, sort of a general look at voting patterns. I mean, you are probably more of an expert on this than I am, but if you pull back and look at like general voting patterns, most, urban centers are larger and have more people, and have been moving right steadily to the left. And we see this population shift, whereas rural areas have been moving more and more to the right and seem more predictive of things like voting for Trump or not following vaccine mandates. And the interesting thing about sheriffs that I often point out to people is that because sheriffs are county officials, even when populations shift, the sheriffs still keep their county. So, even though the vast majority of people voted for Joe Biden, 80% of counties voted for Trump. So 80% of counties in the US, all of which have a sheriff. So this sort of means like 80% of sheriffs are, in charge of what is probably a Trump aligned county. So I think that this also gives some color to like this, how sheriffs interact with this sort of, I think, complicated issue of, local, state, and federal laws, which I mean, I think is growing very, again, chasm like, because we just have such like intense and intentional divisions right now. And we just have a lot of changes in attitudes between rural and urban areas. I sort of see it as a rural urban thing, but I think there are probably other ways to interpret it.
Well, I think Salazar offers a chance to me, because I do want to talk about the rural urban split, but I also want to circle back to something you discussed early on when we were talking about sort of more of the historical nature of sheriffs, which is jail conditions, right? Salazar is interesting, right? Because he's taken this very progressive, defiant stance sort of right now. But he was under fire earlier in the year, right, for deaths in his jail as a result of inmate stabbing. And really, this is kind of a thing that crops up across sheriff's offices, right? Like we have David Clark, who is one of the most sort of famous, prominent pro-Trump sheriffs, who was investigated, right, for deaths in his jail. One very famous kind of dehydration death incident in particular. You have in my own state, right, the sheriff in Washington County, which is by and large the home to one of the more liberal cities in the state, which is Fayetteville, which is the home of the University of Arkansas, who came under serious scrutiny, right, for giving inmates in his jail ivermectin, right, and obviously this is frankly this is kind of a political stunt during the COVID crisis, but also doing it really without them consenting. And so I think that this is an interesting area of sort of the modern sheriff's office where jail conditions can be quite draconian, or at least where the kind of rule the sheriff takes over their jail, it can be so total, as opposed to what you were describing in the past, which is this kind of, I don't want to say idyllic, because incarceration is never necessarily idyllic, but this sort of, very lax, people kind of come and go. Like you said, the nature of what a jail is quite ambiguous. There's a very porous line between who is and isn't incarcerated. And now this sort of pretty consistent drumbeat, right, of stories that come out about malpractice and wrongful deaths. And this, like I said, this case in Arkansas of giving the people in his jail ivermectin. So I do want to kind of take a chance to dig in on jail conditions as a particular aspect of sheriff regulation in the United States.
Right. It's an excellent point. So, I mean, and just to kind of back up, about 85% of jails are run by sheriffs. So this is, in most places, the primary job of a sheriff. Even in, as you've rightly pointed out, like large urban areas. So for example, Chicago, the jail is run by a sheriff. Harris County, the jail is run by a sheriff. So it is really important to note that even in more urban areas, oftentimes the jail is run by an elected sheriff. I think that the issue of jail deaths has to be set against the background of just the explosion of jail growth in the past, in the past few decades, and the fact that it's not stopping. So right now, about a third, so most people know, the United States has more people in prison and jail than anywhere else. About a third of those people, so the most recent figure I have is there's 2.3 million detained people. This might be slightly old, and about a third of them are held in county jails. So it's a massive number of people. And one of the issues with county jails, as if a number of places have looked at, is that jail populations are continuously going up, even as state prison populations are going down. So what we've seen is this sort of overall a minimization of state, maybe not minimization, but a decrease of investment and people in state prisons, and a burst of people in these local county facilities. And one of the reasons for that is, again, gets into sort of complicated county governance, is how jails are funded. So, a kind of remainder of the sheriff history of fee for service is the fact that jails are immensely profitable for sheriffs. So sheriffs can often play major roles in asking county officials to build larger and larger jails. And a lot of data backs this up. There are also, I would add, the USDA provides funding to rural counties for jails as a form of rural development. So the vast majority of these jails that are being built, larger and larger, are in more rural areas, which are just getting both federal and bond money to continue to build very large jails. And we're talking like multi-million-dollar projects. These jails, which again are run by sheriffs, and sheriffs get to sort of decide how they want to run their jail. One of the things that many sheriffs do, especially in rural areas, is rent out jail space. So they either rent it out to the state to hold people who would be otherwise incarcerated in a state prison. This is very common in Louisiana. They rent it to ICE, so it holds people who are facing deportation under ICE proceedings, and they also rent it out to the U.S. Marshals. So they also hold other federal people who are being detained for whatever reason. Those contracts are guaranteed and paid, so they sort of receive like a per diem rate, which is usually around $50 or $60 per person per night. So it's kind of like, I think one Wisconsin sheriff basically said it was like renting a hotel. Like it's a fee for service hotel entity at which they are housing people.
I mean, that is a shocking to be kind of phrasing.
It is. I mean, and the sheriff was pretty upfront. This sheriff, was pretty upfront about, like, I run a hotel. I basically house people and feed, and then you have to do things. You house them, you feed them, you give them medical care. So that's like one backdrop, is just to understand that jails are profitable. They're profitable only when they're full, and they're getting bigger and bigger. At the same time, jails are very, very dangerous. So we don't have very good data on how many people die in jail because no one is required to collect it. Sheriffs are not required to collect data in states. The federal government doesn't collect it. Sheriffs have sort of used their elected political position to argue that they don't have to like keep track of people in their jail. Someone asked me what it's like. Some sheriffs, and this is not true in most large places, but in some places, like, sheriffs couldn't even tell you how many people are there. They don't know how many people are in their jail because they don't have to know. So they don't count. Why would you, and jail also, also to bear in mind, people are in and out rather frequently. So it is, it is an ever-changing count, but it is shocking to think that someone just doesn't even know. And there are many rural jails in which conditions are quite terrible. I was looking at one, I was investigating one jail where people, were quite literally sleeping on the floor, sleeping in sewage, sleeping next to, garbage. Just really gross conditions. And so kind of in tangent with the growth of jails is that jail deaths continue to grow, and jail deaths are growing exponentially even as like prison deaths are going down. So what we see is states have implemented more regulations and
I
shrunk their
think probably, by
population.
the way, for some listeners, it might be helpful to distinguish right then between prison and jails as institutions.
I'm totally happy to do that. So prisons and jails, as I'm using it. So sometimes people just say prison or jail to mean a place where people are incarcerated, which I actually think is fine for the purposes of general talk. A jail specifically is a facility, usually at the county level, usually run by a sheriff, where people are being held mostly pre-trial. So they're mostly pre-trial, or they're folks who are being held usually for sentences less than a year. This is not always true, again, because of bed rentals and changes in various laws, but this is generally what's true. The jail is the place, for most people, the jail is the place you go right after your arrest. You are taken to the jail. A prison is a usually larger facility run by the state, which is where people go after they've been convicted, and usually when they've been convicted of crimes where the sentence is more than a year. So people who are staying, will remain incarcerated, 5, 10, 20, life, those people are in state prison. They are not in county jails. And for that reason, county jails, which are intended to hold people short term, are sort of uniquely unfit to hold people long term. They are not built for that. They have a constant come and go. They have a lot of people who may be suffering from withdrawal of various sorts. It's extremely traumatic because these are often usually people right after arrest. So prison is in that way a bit different because by the time someone is convicted and sent to prison, that person has probably been in jail. And oftentimes state prison is seen as like slightly more stable still incarceration, but usually like slightly more stable than the county jail. But in many states, people are excited to go to the state prison because they want to leave the county jail because the county jail is so terrible and dangerous. And so because of these sort of unique features of county jails and the fact that they keep growing, they are very dangerous. So you have it's a point at which many people are suicidal. It's a point at which many people have mental health crisis. It's a point at which many people are high risk of dying from health or withdrawal or overdose. And I often tell people like the experience of going to jail, even just on the face of it, is right. If I was driving and I got pulled over and arrested and sent to jail, I would have no one to pick up my kid, no one to walk the dog, no one to tell my family where I am, no way to get my medication for the next day, right? You don't get to go home and get your stuff. So really it's like you're grabbed off the street, you're sent to this place, you don't get to talk to anybody, and you don't really know when you're getting out. So it's a really traumatic time for people. It also puts them again at great health risk for anyone with any kind of health condition. And so for that reason, honestly, jails are so dangerous that I think there's a great question as to what impact sheriffs can have on their jails. I will say two things. One thing I will say is that first, there have been very, very few sheriffs running on a platform to decrease the size of their jail. There are sheriffs who run, I think, with the promise of improving jail conditions. But I think what we see is that it is almost impossible to improve jail conditions without substantially decreasing the people held there and really changing what some people might call the culture. So the people working there. So this, I guess sort of includes the folks who I think have like good intentions, the good intentions people who I think intend to change things, but find it very, very hard. I also think that there's a possibility that hasn't quite been proven with data, but I suspect is true, is that jails are so dangerous that no matter the good intentions of any sheriff right now, they simply cannot decrease jail deaths. I guess in other words, I haven't seen a sheriff actually make a substantial dent in how dangerous jails are. On the flip side, there are sheriffs like Sheriff Salazar of San Antonio who has been like uniquely resistant and very upset when he is accused of jail conditions. So he is a person like politically he's been like really defiant, and some of it is quite possibly his personality, that he's been very agitated and defiant when he is told that like his jail is unsafe. And then you have the David Clarks, again, who don't care, say they don't care, never will care, who have people. Yes, he also had a woman, I think, give birth in his jail. And I think, I don't remember who died. But again, this happened in Tarrant County. The sheriff there had a woman give birth on the floor of the jail, which
Tarrant
don't
County
think these things
being where
Fort Worth, Texas.
yes.
Yeah,
Basically coterminous with Fort Worth, Texas.
it is. I mean, he is a Trumpy sheriff, so
right.
But he's also had a large number of jail deaths. There isn't really a lot of data. I mean, I would be interested in doing this or knowing this, but I don't know about the data between a sheriff's politics and the safety of their jails. We do know something about sheriff politics and deportations, which is in essence one might expect. Like the more Trumpy the sheriff, the more deportations they have.
Right. The anecdote though I think about Tarrant County brings me to kind of I think the last thing I really want to dig into, which is getting back to that urban rural divide, is the sort of yes, they are probably the less common case, but they do right these areas where you have that perhaps tension between counties that are home to maybe large urbanized areas, right? They're probably trained liberal even, and maybe whatever tension exists between that county level office of sheriff and the broader politics and even maybe the politics specifically of the law enforcement offices and institutions in sort of the main city, right? Because you do have places like Tarrant County, Texas, which is home to Fort Worth. You have perhaps it maybe is unique and unto itself, a sort of sui generis example, right? But you have LA County, right, which is massive, right? Just a massive county, both in population and in terms of just how large it is by land area, right? Includes LA, but also a ton of other places, and is just an enormous place in and of itself. But I think it might be interesting to talk a little bit about how the office of sheriff functions or even plays out in terms of the politics in some of these more urbanized places. Because I think a lot of it, we have focused in somewhat on the like you said, that 80% of counties that that are essentially, if not, we want to say pro-Trump, sort of more conservative, or places where more conservative politics reign, and therefore you expect a certain kind of officer. But in the counties where there are those larger urban areas that I think are more able maybe to shape, right, the politics, I think that's an interesting space to explore the urban rural divide, because it's almost like it's really getting to play out rather than having like, here's an urban area over here and here's a rural area over here, and they're sort of away from one another and they exist as bubbles. There are these places where you can actually find those things kind of colliding, right?
Right. I mean, and this sort of, as you say, and as we talk about, like the issue with counties as opposed to cities is that a county might include, and this again goes back to a lot of the work of prosecutors and prosecutor elections that many scholars have done, but that because an urban area is situated within a county, one of the things that often happens is that county level elections are more heavily influenced by the people living outside of the rural area in the county than the people in the urban area. And in terms of sheriffs, some of this makes some sense. So I was thinking of an example in, there's a few examples actually I have. So there is often a time when the people in the urban core have immense like differences with with policing than the people in the more maybe suburban or exurban kind of areas outside the city. And to your point again, I would also like the definition of rural is kind of floaty, is kind of kind of up in the air. So like we have suburban and exurban and quasi-rural, and but counties often include like a little bit of both in most places. So in many of these places that are outside of urban areas, they're more likely to be policed by sheriff's departments or offices. So LA is a good example, right? The city of LA is policed primarily by the LAPD, and contract cities and parts of LA County are going to be primarily policed by the LA Sheriff's Department. So the people most invested in the sheriff's office and who the sheriff is are the people not in the urban area, because they often just don't know or don't encounter their sheriff. And this is, I mean, as an example, for example, I live in Dallas. There's a Dallas Police Department and a Dallas Sheriff Department, and I have almost like no interaction with the Dallas Sheriff Department. Like if I see police on the street, I see Dallas police. I don't see Dallas sheriffs, that's just not a thing I see. So it's a normal kind of, I think, thought process for most people. LA is a little unique because they have so many cities that contract, small cities that contract with the sheriff's department, that they sort of have this interesting ecosystem, kind of born of a special, like a special blend of politics, that such that a lot of the contract cities that do contract with the LA Sheriff's Department are some are largely white, but some are not. Like you have Compton, which is an independent city that contracts with the LA Sheriff's Department. So you have a lot of clash here, and this is why the LA Sheriff's Department, I think, has faced a lot of criticism, is because they are policing a lot of Black and brown communities, and those communities are not happy with the policing they're getting. And in many places, actually, the tension between the sheriff and other, more urban people is pretty obvious. One county I was thinking of it's a county called Loudoun County in Virginia. It actually got, probably people know it more for the school board stuff. So they've had like immense fights over schools and school board. Loudoun County is interesting because it's a county that was more conservative. So there's sort of a core of more rural-ish, exurban, more conservative people, and then a great influx of people from DC. So they've had a great influx of diverse people, including people for other countries who are working for like tech companies and that sort of thing, who have come to Loudoun County. And as a result, the politics have changed immensely. As the politics have changed in the county, one of the things they tried to do last year was they wanted to create a police department. So the county commission basically shifted from mostly Republican to mostly Democrat. And the new mostly Democrat county commission was less happy with their long-term Republican sheriff, who was rather conservative. And he had been in office, decades and had done things his way for decades. Um, Overturn in sheriff's offices is very rare. So something like 90% of incumbents get reelected for there are various reasons. And so they wanted to create a police department that was controlled by the county commissioners, which were largely Democrat, and that they thought would reflect better the values of the people. The sheriff's office got really, really mad about it. And they wrote like 100-page report about like why this was a terrible idea. But I do think we see in many places now this tension of like, well, do we create an independent police department that polices, new areas? Do we keep the sheriff's office still policing these areas, right? Because demographics are changing. And in LA is a similar debate, like should these places create their own police department? And then not contract anymore with the LASD. And there's sort of like, I think, benefits largely, usually the problem is the economic problem. Louisiana is another place where often the county sheriff is policing cities. And in some cases, right, cities have opted to create their own police department so that their residents are no longer policed by the sheriff's office because they find the sheriff's office, right, like too tough on crime, or the residents of their city don't, in one case I'm thinking of in particular, it's because the residents of that city are mostly Black. The sheriff's office mostly is white and, has a history of being racist. And so the residents of that city don't want that sheriff's office policing their city. So I do think we see this like sort of tension about like, and this I think is interesting because it gets to this like, when sheriffs are popularly elected, what does that mean? And we know that policing is very siloed, right? Like there's lots of police departments, lots of local law enforcement agencies. And so sheriffs brag because they're elected and they say this makes them more representative. But I think this sort of begs the question of like, what exactly, like, are they more representative and of what?
Well, thank you so much. It's been a really, I think, enlightening conversation. I do have a fun question that I ask everyone at the end of this show, which is, and it's open ended. You can base it kind of on where you live and work now, or where you grew up. But because we are so focused on particularly places away from like the main centers and things like that, which is if someone comes to your neck of the woods or an area you kind of consider your neck of the woods, what is one place? It can, restaurant, museum, natural site or park or whatever it is that you would say like, you've got to do this. This is the thing you got to do if you come to my area and experience that might maybe be a little bit less advertised.
I have to think of something exciting in Dallas. You've put me in this very unique position. Which I laugh at because I grew up in the Dallas area, and so you would think I would know more. One of the things I'll say this. So one of the things I think is very interesting about Dallas that has started to happen is a very interesting reclamation of the history of Dallas. So I think most people don't think of Dallas as having as much of a history of segregation as it has. So Dallas is actually one of the most segregated cities in the United States. And so I think that that has come forth. And so I think that some of the things that people can do is maybe less go to, but there's been a lot of reclamation of, so Dallas, like many cities, has a fair park area. There's the Texas State Fair is there. There's got the Cotton Bowl and various other things. So that area was once a Black neighborhood that was torn down, right, to create this sort of stuff that would benefit the city, right, sort of financially. And so I think there's been a movement now to like reclaim that history. And so I think if people come to Dallas, like that's the thing I would encourage them to go to and think about is like how the longtime residents of Dallas and the Black neighborhoods of Dallas are really seeking to like reclaim this history of their, sort of struggles in Dallas and kind of how the official narrative has gotten a little bit whitewashed, so to speak.
No, I think that's really interesting. I'll have to go. Like I said, my wife is from Fort Worth, so we are in the DFW area pretty regularly. Although we don't always make the trek over to the Dallas side of that. But I think that's a good thing to think about the next time I'm in the area. Jessica, it's been a joy to have you. This has been really fun. I think people are going to learn a lot about sheriff and sheriff offices and how they interact with American politics more generally. So thanks so much for making the time for this.
Thank you so much. Take care.
You too. The Periphery is a production of the Pulaski Institution. I've been your host, Alan Elrod. Our music was written, recorded, and produced by Brandon Ragsdale and Cody Smith. Thank you for coming, and please join us next time.